Hey there, my name is Ken, and I am the CEO of Audio. Audio is the first social audiobook app where you can find, join, and create audiobook clubs. What's really awesome about Audio is we're just $12 a book, which is 20% cheaper than Audible, and we're a completely self-funded startup and not a billion-dollar empire. If you're interested in creating and owning an audiobook club, we actually pay our book club owners $1 per book sold, which is an amazing way for book influencers and book lovers to create real revenue for themselves while building amazing community and opportunity for those around them. As a special reward, we're offering 2 audiobook credits for the price of 1. Just go to kengbarton.com and sign up using my link in bio. Thanks again to everyone at TBR. We're so excited to be a part of it, and we can't wait to see more folks launching, joining, and reading audiobooks together on Audio.
All right, welcome to What Are the Limits of Cozy Fantasy for TBRCon 2025, sponsored by FanFiAddict. I am your host, Marshall J. Moore, and with me are a slate of fantastic cozy fantasy authors. Why don't you all go ahead and introduce yourself, starting with Travis.
Hi, I'm Travis Baldree. I am the author of Legends and Lattes and Bookshops and Bone Dust and the upcoming Brigands and Bread Knives.
All right. Stephanie?
Succinct.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Burgis. I am the author of various cozy fantasies for children and adults, and my next one is going to be Louie and the Witch Queen, which comes out next month.
All right. Mariana?
Oh, hi. I'm Mariana Costa, sometimes Mari Costa for comics. I do graphic novels, and I just put out my debut novel, Shoestring Theory, which if I were smart, I would have it on hand, but it's like way over there.
Marty?
Hi, I'm Marti Dumas, and I'm the author of several cozy fantasy books for children, the latest of which is the Wild Seed Witch series.
Fantastic. And Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Beth Durst. I'm the author of The Spell Shop, as well as 27 other books, but this is my cozy fantasy. And my next one is The Enchanted Greenhouse, which comes out in July, and it's set in the same world as The Spell Shop.
All right. And I am Marshall J. Moore, the author of Son of a Sailor, a cozy pirate tale, and its sequels, Prisoners of a Pirate Queen and Enemy of the Empire. So with introductions out of the way, let's dive right into the titular question. What are the limits of cozy fantasy? Or to reframe the question, are there any themes and or content which the inclusion of will nullify the cozy element inherent in the genre? Let's go ahead and start with Sarah.
I think there are no limits to cozy fantasy. When I started writing Spell Shop, I actually, unlike other books that I've written, I didn't start with like a particular idea or like cool, magical, whatever, like I usually do. I started with how I wanted the book to feel. Like essentially I started with a vibe. I knew how I wanted the reader to feel. I knew how I wanted me to feel. So I opened up this Word document and typed things that make me happy and put this whole list of like jam, mer horses, things that talk that shouldn't talk, books. Now this whole list, and I crafted everything in the book around creating that feeling. But I don't think to be cozy fantasy, that means that you need to have a particular set of themes or items or things in it. Nor do I think that the reverse is true, that there are things that you can't have in it. I think so long as you are in service to that feeling, to that safe space, that warm hug, that deep breath, that feeling that you're like on a couch with a blanket around you and a cat in your lap, ideally a winged cat, reading a book with like snow falling down, then it can work. I mean, you can have like The Teller of Small Fortunes by Julie Leong is quintessential cozy fantasy. And it's about racism and xenophobia. My book Spell Shop has a strong anti-authoritarian message and the importance of sharing information and also a whole lot of jam. So I think so long as it's in service to that everything's okay feel, then it can work for cozy. Some things like work better and would be like really hard. And like, maybe why are you writing a cozy if that's what you want to say? But I don't think there's anything that's like off limits.
All right. What do you think, Marty?
I totally agree. I don't like limits, so then that's really great. And I love that your answer is basically vibes because I mean, right? Like that's it's 100% vibes is part of the thing. I think that for me, the defining elements, if we have to go there, this is like one of those unfair questions, like what's your favorite book? Like what? Like that's such a rude question. However, if we are sort of going there and I'm just putting some chips on the table, I think that for me, the power of relationship and people in relation is a really strong through thread for all the books that I personally would consider cozy fantasy. Fun fact, I never considered any of my own cozy fantasy. They were just fantasy to me. And then as they were shelved and readers were reading and booksellers were shelving them, I was told that they were cozy fantasy. I was like, oh, this is a thing. Like I should probably go seek more of it out because really for me, this was all the best parts of the Lord of the Rings books, right? Which were not the battle scenes for me. Dude, I know, like for some people, yes, right? But for me, I would literally like skim over them. And I've read that series and the Silmarillion, I mean, a gajillion times, and I couldn't tell you a battle stroke in there. But the rest of it, the connectivity, the tone, the vibe, it was all there. And so then that's the parts that I wanted. It was the parts I wanted to revel in. So then it's the parts that I get to play in my stories too.
Very nice. Mariana, what do you think?
I completely agree. I really relate to Marty in like not finding my book a cozy fantasy. I get a lot of actually reviews about this because it starts immediately in the darkest note possible. It starts like quite sinister, like quite grim, quite hopeless. And then it just kind of manages to build up from there. But it's one of those things where it's like, am I allowed to call Shoestring Theory a cozy fantasy if it dead ass just starts on a suicide? And turns out as long as like the vibes, exactly, I totally agree with like both Sarah and Marty, as long as the vibes in the end up with like this warm hug that kind of gives you hope in the world, that's the point of cozy fantasy, is like making you feel good overall, even if there are moments that make you like that make you are either uncomfortable or like sad. If at the end of the day the feeling that you get in the book itself is a cozy warm hug, then I think that's what makes it like a cozy fantasy to me.
Stephanie, do you think there are any limits to cozy fantasy?
I think it's a really interesting and really subjective question. I remember a few months ago, there was a great piece on Reactor Magazine talking about one of my favorite cozy fantasy series, which is by Lish McBride. It's called, I think, the Uncanny Romance series. To me, these are the coziest comfy reads, comfort reads that you could possibly imagine. I will reread them when I feel bad. They always make me feel better. But apparently, there are some people who are like appalled to see them described as cozy fantasy because all of the characters are survivors of really terrible events. And so there's a real darkness. It's not the kind of cozy fantasy that says everything is okay because it always will be, you know. It's the kind of cozy fantasy that says you can go through bad things, but find happiness and strength. And I love that. So I've seen similar arguments about my upcoming books, Wooing the Witch Queen, because again, the hero and heroine have both survived pretty dark childhoods. And for me, the reason why I think of it as still a cozy fantasy is because we start as well, with the heroine, she's already out. She has overthrown her wicked uncle. She's on the throne. No one's going to hurt her again. The hero begins his journey by escaping in the first chapter. And so we see them recovering. We see them growing together and finding comfort and finding found family and drinking the most delicious hot chocolates and spiced wines and eating apple strudel, and so that's a very comfy thing for me that doesn't pretend that, there aren't bad things in the world, but you can still come out and have this wonderful warmth.
And finally, Travis, do you think there are any limits to cozy fantasy?
I think there's like two different perspectives on this. There's a perspective as a writer who's theoretically writing cozy fantasy, and there's the perspective of a reader who wants to get more of something that they already like. I didn't set out to write cozy fantasy, and so as I write more books that are basically in the same series, I really kind of push back against the notion that I should have to adhere to any sort of formula at all, that I should have to make any nods to anything. I just immediately want to, I immediately want to break that. So the third book I wrote is basically, the premise is, you know what, maybe a small business opening and a renovation montage and some baked goods are not going to fix your life. And what if that happens? But if I were to try and encapsulate it for like readership and the usefulness of a label to find things that you want, I guess what I would boil it down to is that I think obviously it has to include some kind of fantastical elements, or it might as well be cozy sci-fi. And that ultimately the perspective is one that is empathetic, that it's clear that the author's perspective is empathetic. And I think you can do whatever you want in that, as long as ultimately your perspective is empathetic. I don't think anybody would read Game of Thrones and say, you know what, the author's perspective for this story is very, very empathetic, regardless of what happens inside of it. And ultimately, I think that in the same way that capital R romance has to have a happy ending, I think ultimately the ending probably has to be affirming, that you feel okay or better once you finish than when you started. And those two combined elements, I think, give you a lot of leeway. I still hate putting any fence around anything, but that's probably what I would say.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, I do sort of agree that genre is somewhat subjective, but also it's more a nebulous collection of identifiers. Like, not all horror stories have vampires, and not all vampire stories are horror stories, but there's a large amount of overlap. And I think it's largely about establishing reader expectation. Like, to your point, Travis, of speaking the author writing with empathy for the story and for the characters, you can do whatever you want within those confines, but if it's a cozy, then there are certain expectations that come with that. Like Mariana, you can start a cozy with a suicide, it turns out, but you probably shouldn't end it with one. So, since you all said no to the question of are there any limits, I'm going to finagle this next question very slightly. Are there any sort of themes or content that you can include but should tread more carefully or take extra consideration in approaching? Marti, you go ahead and be the first one to answer that right on the spot.
Excellent. Right. So I think that, so for me, I write for children. Well, I'm going to say I currently write for children. In the foreseeable future, I will probably write for children, but I want to leave a little room for myself, right? So I write for children for now. And for me, growing up, as like I was a super avid reader growing up, and the kids were feral, like they were loose. The adults did not care what was going on, or worse, they'd just all be dead. Like it was just dead adults, no substitutes. And so that, but I love the idea. And I think that this is probably why so many of my books get characterized in that the children have exploration and adventure, but they still have safety nets, right? Mm-hmm. Like, for sure that these kids are going to be okay. There are loving adults around them. So for me, I think that without that safety net, that you're creating a cushion zone, a soft place to land, that these stories would feel very, very different and that they never would have been another place. So that's not a full answer to your question, but it is sort of getting that conversation ball rolling. I wonder if anybody else has thoughts around that.
I would say that when I'm setting out to write a cozy, what I write is romantic fantasy for adults. And when I'm writing this, there are definitely subjects where I am going to be very careful because of what Sarah was talking about with giving your reader a safe space. And so, like I said, many of my characters have very dark things in their past, but as the readers are writing, I want them to know that, things may be scary, things, there may be, real issues at stake, but just for one thing, you're never going to have to worry about the heroine suddenly being sexually assaulted out of nowhere. This is not something that's going to happen in one of my books personally. This isn't me saying no one should ever, or there aren't ways to do it. For me personally, I want my books to be a safe space. where you're going to go and you'll read and you will empathize with these characters having intense adventures, having to make difficult decisions and fight hard battles, but you're going to be supported in that. You don't have to be afraid that when you turn the page, something really traumatic and scarring is going to happen and give you nightmares.
Very well put. Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I think
as far as themes that you go ahead, you go ahead.
Oh no, you can go ahead.
As far as themes that you should tread lightly to include, I think this. So if you're talking from like a writer's perspective, I think that ultimately what things you include and don't include should ultimately be guided by what you want to talk about. That should establish the boundaries, not so much the genre. If I were to advise someone who's writing something on how to establish those boundaries, the book I'm writing doesn't have incredibly horrible things. It's not nihilistic, but I didn't make those decisions because then it wouldn't be cozy enough. I made it because those elements would not have supported the character's journey and the things that I actually wanted to talk about, the dialogue I wanted to have with the reader. If the thing you want to talk about with the reader, if that dialogue you want to have, suddenly the bounds of the things you can include makes it not cozy, I feel strongly that you should still just write that thing. If it doesn't end up cozy, fine. You were truthful about what you were including to support the thing you wanted to say. So if I were to give someone advice on that, it would be choose your boundaries based on what you want to say, not based on the genre you want to land in.
Very well put. Sarah, what were you going to add?
I was just going to say the one thing that I would say, that, I don't even know if you should tread lightly or just don't tread there at all, is hopelessness. Because I think cozy fantasy, I actually think fantasy in general, although there is definitely a subset of hopeless fantasy, but I neither read nor write that, so whatever. But fantasy is a literature of hope and empowerment. And cozy fantasy in particular is all about hope at its core. You should read a cozy fantasy, not just to escape from the moment, but to escape and then come back stronger because you found some light, you found some warmth. So I would say that hopelessness is the one thing that I wouldn't, if you're writing about hopelessness, you probably should not be writing cozy fantasy because it's not a good mix.
And that really speaks to the power of tone and how that's one of the more defining aspects of the subgenre. I just want to address really quick, because I see we do have some questions in the chat, that we'll be taking audience questions at the end of the first hour. This is scheduled for 90 minutes. So 4 o'clock Eastern, we'll start taking audience questions. Hold on to those, or I'll try and scroll back up to find them. Shifting gears slightly. The defining hallmark of cozy fantasy tends to be that the scale of the stories is focused on a more personal level. That's not to say that the narrative stakes can't be consequential to the greater world. For instance, Mariana and Shoestring theory, the fate of an entire kingdom is at stake. But that in cozy, the emphasis is placed on the protagonist's personal stake in the outcome. Again, in the case of Shoestring theory, the relationship between the protagonist and his husband. How do you match the stakes of the story to a more intimate scale of cozy fantasy? How do you tie the protagonist's own desires and goals into that story's outcome? Mariana, if you want to start, since I called out your work.
I actually got really excited about this question because it kind of harkens back for me to one of my favorite shows of all time, which is Cardcaptor Sakura, and it's something that like really, really inspired and informed the way that I write for the rest of my life. And something that happens in that show, it's a very old show, so I'm not going to be spoiling a lot, is that the protagonist is told that like something earth-shattering is going to happen. Something is going to get changed in a way that is so like awful that it's going to like not destroy the world, but like do something that's like quite monumental. And the thing that ends up happening is just like the boy that she likes disappears. And that is not monumental to the world. That's just kind of the stake that she has that destroys her personal environment. So for me, every time that I write stories, the world is the thing that matters the most to the character that you're trying to relate to. Like that's really what I'm trying to make the priority. So while I think like the fate of the world or the fate of the kingdom is like a good backdrop in order to like raise the stakes, I don't really care about making that really important so long as a protagonist and the reader going along with the protagonist has this like impetus to something really, really personal to them that makes them like really relatable, if that makes any sense at all, if I'm just not like talking out of my ass a little bit. I like the personal stakes are really what drive the story for me in every single story that I tell, even if there is lip service to like a kingdom in ruin or like the world being destroyed. It's always about the feelings that the characters have that you are going to be able to relate to. And I think that really makes a cozy fantasy, because when those feelings get like, when there's the catharsis of like something good happening to the characters, you feel it too, because hopefully I've done my job and I've managed to make you empathize.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think empathy is really so key to cozy fantasy. And I think it lends itself really well because, you know, fantasy, extreme sport of empathy right there. We're being asked to identify with and open our hearts to these characters who have powers or are blue or wings in a world that can't possibly exist with dragons and talking plants and whatever. And so I think having that empathy for the characters is such at the heart of cozy fantasy. I've talked about it being low stakes and high emotional resonance. And I think that is one of the hallmarks, is that you really care about the characters, that you follow them really tightly, no matter what else is going on in the world, whether it is saving the world or whether it's just, you know, opening a jam shop or whatever. Caring about the characters is paramount.
Definitely. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? All right, let's move along. So one of the criticisms that I hear often leveled at cozy fantasy from people who inevitably have not read cozy fantasy is that the books are too slow or that nothing seems to happen, which I think, as everyone here having written cozy fantasy knows, is very much not the case. The question I have for you is, how do you incorporate tension and conflict into cozy fantasy without sacrificing those cozy elements? And Travis, if you'll kick this one off.
Sure. So when we talk about like tension and conflict and stakes, honestly, I don't like to think about that in those terms for writing a story. What really matters to me at the end of the day is there a question that is asked that I'm interested in the answer to? And I think that frames the mechanic that keeps me reading a book in a way that gives me a lot more latitude to address that in interesting ways. You're still ultimately have to ask a question that somebody cares about, and all of that groundwork of character and empathy is what is your mechanism for investing someone and wanting the answer to a question. But all you have to do is ask a question that somebody wants to know the answer to. That's what keeps you up reading. It could be, what is the fate of this character who is hanging off the edge of a cliff? It could be, what is the result of their decision to reveal a secret to their oldest friend that they haven't spoken in a long time? It doesn't really matter what that is. For me, that's tension, that's stakes. It doesn't have anything to do with CGI explosions or the potential of harm. It has to do with, do I care about the answer? And I think that as authors, we can be asking questions at all of these different scales of time. You have the largest question, which is about the arc of your character over the course of the book. How are things going to end up in the end? But at all of these different scales, at the chapter scale, at the scene scale, at the paragraph scale, sometimes even at the sentence scale, we can be asking interesting questions that hopefully the reader cares about. And if you boil it down to that, it really takes a lot of the pressure off to find a pyrotechnic or potentially hurtful way to introduce tension.
I think it comes back to everything that Travis and Sarah said about empathy. For me, when I think about it less of questions being asked than about what does each character in the scene care about? What is each character hoping for right now? What is each character dreading right now? And that doesn't have to be, if you're hoping and dreading for something that's going to be really important to you, that doesn't have to be kingdom shaking. You can be hoping desperately for this person to maybe start liking you a little bit. You can be hoping desperately that this new business venture you've started, will get positive reviews on its first day, or that the first person to eat your pastry that you've cooked will actually like it. It's just really getting deep into the emotional mindset. And if every character in the scene cares a lot about what's going to happen, as they're interacting, and want something, and you care for them, you want them to be happy, you want them to turn out well, then a scene can be very tense, even if the stakes are comparatively, objectively tiny to an outsider.
Right. So one of my writing partners once said to me a really hilarious, she was being funny, but she said it in a mean way, which was, I don't know how you keep making action scenes in a library. Okay, fair point. But I think that really it has to do with a person's perspective on stakes. For me, the biggest stakes in my life are the connections that I have to other people, right? And so then it's the difference between getting the Instagram highlight reel of someone and knowing the actual intimate moments that make them who they are, right? So then I think that in some ways the stakes are higher in stories like this, because it is often, again, we're not doing rules, but it is often in the smaller, like more impactful moments of your life that these stakes are woven in. And obviously, as a part of like a tapestry of humanity, the things that affect us are affecting things at a larger scale. Sometimes it's easier to describe that, put it in the context of that. But for me, it really comes down to what do you actually think of as important? And for me, those small moments are, that's absolutely what is the most important. And I'm not saying that but just because several of the doctors have said the same.
Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
I also think that you mentioned this, Marshall, when you were introducing the question, but it is quite reductive to say nothing happens, because unless you're Twilight style, blank chapter, blank chapter, blank chapter, something is happening on the page. It's just that you may not find it interesting. And sometimes that's good. You can't really be stimulated all the time. Sometimes you need a break in the middle of very high stakes, high level scenes in order to just kind of pause a little bit and check in with the character, what they're thinking, etc. And some people find that quite boring. Some people are nothing happens in this scene. Why did it get added? And it's well, if the writer wrote it down, they must find it important at the very least. And it's just not for you. And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, I wanted to push back too on the idea of nothing happening being a bad thing. I think that's a feature, not a bug. It could be fun to just hang out in a bookstore for a little while, reshelve your books or make jam or whatever.
A little bit episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to reiterate, that was a hypothetical, not something that I think.
No, you'd never, Marshall, never.
No. I do think, specifically, as you were saying, Mariana, there's sort of a rhythm to narrative, and there's a reason that a lot, you'll see this, especially I feel in movies, there will be the big second act set piece action scene, and then the scene immediately after is something smaller and quieter and more dramatic, because there's that rhythmic flow. You can't just be at 100 the whole time, because that's not sustainable, because it will exhaust the audience and the reader, and they will get tired of that. Shifting gears slightly. So I think we touched briefly on the Marti, especially you were bringing this up, the intimate connections between people is sort of the core of cozy, and what really drives that more personal, character-driven narrative. One of the other core elements of cozy fantasy I find that ties into that is the element of community. The supporting cast and their relationships to the protagonists are often very central to the plot of the story. What are your favorite tools for building memorable supporting characters, and how do their interactions with the protagonist help shape the protagonist's growth? And Sarah, if you want to start this one.
Yeah. My side character is one of my favorite characters that I've ever written, Kaz, the sentient spider plant. So I feel very strongly about side characters being very important. I approach side characters like they're the protagonist. I mean, everybody thinks they're the hero of their own story. These are fully realized people with their own wants and fears and needs and backstories and future dreams and so forth. They just happen to not have the podium at the moment. But I approach them like they're fully realized people or plants. And I always have to fall in love with them in order to write them. In terms of sheer technical, how I do it, I sometimes hold auditions. I'll be writing a scene and I'll like try out a character. I'm like, you're amusing. You may stay. No, go home.
We'll call you.
Yeah, I saw. Sorry, go for it.
Nope, you first.
I was just going to say, I once attended, just to go to the opposite side of fantasy from Cozy, I attended a really interesting George R. R. Martin talk, and something he said that it really made an impact on me was you have to remember every time your protagonist walks through a city gate, the guard holding the door thinks that they're the hero of the story. And I think that's just so important to keep in your mind, is that there are no lesser characters in their own minds. And so I'm just backing up Sarah on this. Over to you, Travis.
Yeah, I have a rule, which is that no character can be in the story with a name unless I would be willing to write a story about them. And that if I have characters that don't support their own story, that maybe I start mashing them together to create a new one. Character A, B, and C who just weren't quite at that level, if I could combine them into someone else, who would that person be? The other thing I end up doing to support this is that I will go back and steal main characters from stories that failed and make them side characters, which is a great shorthand for getting somebody in fast. I read somewhere that if you have a good idea, use it. Don't save it, period. So I've tried to take that to heart. Any raw material from something that may have died on the vine or that I thought I might get back to later, nope, you can use it now. Because I'm one of those people in a game that saves all my potions until the very end of the game and has never used any of them and has just save scummed my way through. And I don't want to be that as a writer. I want to use all the potions.
Very good. Anyone else, as far as the community element, have any thoughts to weigh in?
I agree.
All right. Me too. So similarly to that question, another one of the key elements that I find really helps to ground Cozy is the sense of place. A community is more than just the people that inhabit it. It's also the physical setting itself. That could be the island of Caltree with its mer horses, or the bustling cosmopolitan city of Thune, or Fabian's Castle. Just use some of your own work for examples. How do you make a world feel real and lived in, and how does the setting of the story interact with the main character's arc? And Stephanie, if you want to take this one.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the best writing workshops I ever attended many, many years ago at a WisCon, we were asked by the Leah Cutter to write a description of a room we knew really well. So first it was just a flat description, like take 5 minutes, you write down the elements of the room. There's a computer, there's a table, there's a bookcase. Then write a description of the room on a day when you're really happy. And you say, this is the sun shines in through the window just right. And, there's this wonderful, little bit of the wall where you can almost see a face. And finally, write a description of the room on a really bad day. So like, it is so dark in these corners and there's dust over here, which I never noticed. So I think there has to be a lot of personality in every setting description. And you have to, for me, it's really important that we're always seeing it through the character's arc and how they're seeing it that day. And that comes out in all sorts of ways. So in Wooing the Witch Queen, Felix, the hero, he starts out in his own archducal court, which is very much, I have to say, based on 19th century Vienna. And everything is very glittering. Everything looks spotless. He is constantly on display. He is a political puppet. He has zero agency whatsoever. And when he goes to Saskia's castle in the neighboring kingdom, it looks incredibly scary to him, because it's set up to be scary. Her thing is she's a wicked queen. She's notorious. She's going to scare everyone off they're terrified that she'd do anything. So, as he's walking up, he sees the skulls are blazing with green fire on the road, as he's going up the jagged mountain path and, the whole thing. But it ends up becoming the warmest, coziest home for him inside. And it's all about sort of, just the little details that the character finds. So, for instance, the castle library is something that, from Saskia's point of view, is depressing. She walks in there, she sees the mess that her uncle made. It's this disaster. Her mother used to love this library. Now it's, she just walks in and can't bear it and steps out. Felix walks in and he says, "Oh my God, look at all these incredible books, and I get to be safe and I'm on my own and no one is judging me." He's supposed to be a dark wizard, so he's wearing a mask and cloak. No one can even see his expressions anymore. He's free. And I think as long as we keep our minds as we're writing on how the characters are reacting to this environment, what it means to them on a personal level, then the setting is going to end up feeling very vivid and real.
Absolutely. Anyone want to add to that?
That was perfect. Yeah,
I was
totally.
gonna say, you add some more.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was
I agree. I think the one thing that I would personally add, as coming from an illustrator background, coming from someone who does comics, having to suddenly describe my backgrounds instead of just drawing them and being like, there they are, is really, like, it makes me put a lot of emphasis on the visual element in a way where it's like, it's not just the visual. I can also add in like smell, taste, sound, and that always really livens up the environment, especially when it's personal to the character. Like, oh, this character like smells his favorite, like, I don't know, cherries or like baked goods on the window, and like that always adds a lot of texture to the world.
Yeah,
one of my favorite things to do, just in the messing around phase of anything, is to have different characters walk through the same space, because they're all going to notice different things. Like, not everybody has like the super smeller, right? Where they're going to like, but some people are. Some people notice the geometry of spaces. Like, I feel like the space, the way that you experience the space as a reader tells you so much more about the character than maybe even the author realizes sometimes, but it's one of my favorite things. So I mess around with it on purpose.
One of the beauties of doing the character perceived observation of the world is that it's subjective, and it helps you stay away from the uncanny valley of fantasy where you over describe your world to the point where people start to poke holes in your logic and then everything falls apart. If you have to tell me about the monetary system and how all of the magic works and 500 years of, elvish history in order to set the scene, I'm so much more likely to lose faith in your storytelling. And having that personal perspective on what you're seeing really makes you constrain it to a subjective perspective, and not too much, because how many things am I going to notice when I walk into a room? And so it's just such a great tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So the most important element of any narrative, I think, is the emotional core. And as authors, we should be striving to write stories that are emotionally authentic and will consequently resonate with our readers, rather than trying to adhere to the conventions of a specific genre or subgenre as hard and fast rules. So my question is, how do you identify the emotional core of your story, and how does that help guide you through the process of constructing your narrative? Travis, I think you have some thoughts and feelings on this one.
I do, because I literally can't write a story without one, I have discovered. To me, without an emotional core, a story is just a bunch of events, and I don't care about them. And I found this out the hard way. I thought I knew what I was doing and had a great idea, and it just didn't function without that. So I call it like the emotional engine, and for me, this is going to sound silly, but what I do is I'm basically just looking back through my life and my experience and trying to find a moment where I was at a crossroads and I chose one direction or another. And I'll vividly remember this because I probably obsessed over it. Not only do I know what happened as a result of the choice I made, but I probably thought endlessly about what would have happened if I had made a different choice. So I already have 2 potential character arcs already mapped out. And if I can take that experience and transplant it into a character, ideally more than one character, so that they can be going on parallel and perpendicular and occasionally intersecting journeys, then all of a sudden I have a story that I understand how it functions. I understand where you start, how you feel, and why you get where you get. and potentially how that might have gone any number of different ways. And if I have that, ideally, a certain percentage of readers have had a similar experience. And if they do, you've already made enormous inroads to getting them on board with your characters, because they are characters now that they can relate to. So that's my advice. Look back in your life for some place where you ached over something and find a way to give that a quarter turn and transplant it into your characters.
Absolutely. And that really ties back into how we were talking earlier about empathy being one of the core tenets of Cozy. Anyone else have something to add to that?
I would just say I'm not an outliner in any way. I don't plan almost anything for my stories, except when I'm forced to by my publishers when I am actually capable of writing a proposal. But the thing is that I do is I'm always trying to stay in that empathetic space, like you're saying, Marshall, where you're thinking deeply in each scene, like how is my protagonist feeling in this moment? What is it reminding of him? How is it pushing against all of his or her buttons? And I do a lot of thinking. When I have been promoting my kids' books, I do a lot of school visits, and we talk about writing a story. And the sort of formula, which is very simplified, but just to get the kids started, I'll often start with was you have a character who has a problem. They think they know how to solve it. What do they want in order to solve this problem, and what do they actually need? And so, because in a tragedy, they'll get what they want and it's not what they need. In a happy ending, they get what they need, even if it's completely different from what they wanted in the beginning of the story. And so I sort of make my way through the book that way. And when I get stuck, I write lots of little notes to myself. I've got this fat notebook, full of handwriting saying, why does she want to do this? What is she after? What would actually help at this point? What would be really awkward right now? And once I've got a draft, that's when I go back through and I finally actually pull out the kind of themes that Travis is talking about. I'm so jealous that you know it from the beginning. And it's looking at all the elements and thinking, what are the common elements? What is the emotional core? What is the actual message sort of buried in this story, even that I can now clarify and bring out for the final drafts?
I think the key is to just be as honest as possible. I mean, we're not writing facts, but we're writing truth. Yeah. So I think if you're just as honest about the character, if they feel as real as and fully realized as possible, and you're seeing the world through their eyes, then it'll work.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. Like, I'm really vibing with that. I think that is the reality point, right? Like it would be very difficult to connect with a story that was purely alien to you, purely fantasy, right? But no matter what, if you're doing that is the point of connection. That emotional core is the point of connection for the people who are coming in. And sometimes it's the point of fear. Like, just for clarity, like, there are definitely books that don't have an emotional core intentionally, right? Day of the Jackal, no emotional core, none whatsoever, right? And that's on purpose, right? And there are some people who are needing, for whatever reason, it's not me, but there are people who are needing that for themselves, and mine are on the other side of that, where it's like 90%. It's 90% emotional core that we're moving through in here, and therefore you just buy into all the magic because the main part was so real. Yeah. I was cutting Mariana off by accident, I think, because we're lagging each other. So I saw it after. I was like, she was moving. No. Okay, so I apologize.
Yeah, I just want to say, actually, you kind of set me up for this, because to that end, I think that even books without an emotional core, they will have one, because human beings are so emotive to begin with. And I remember reading really dry history books and putting myself in that and being like, oh my God, damn, that sucks. And that was the emotional core, is the reader's interaction with the work. So I think as long as it's something that can make someone feel emotions, that's the emotional core, is what the reader will bring to the work. And I think that's always really important.
I really love it.
Can I just say, actually, I'm sorry. I was just going to add one more thing, which is that as a reader myself, or as a watcher of TV or movies, the one thing that makes me angriest is when I don't believe a character's action. When they do something just because the writers thought it'd be a fun turn of the plot. I'm like, but they would never do that. But we just spent 6 seasons learning they would never do that. And there's no reason for them to do it
It's
now.
like, you wrote them. You told me this is how they work. Okay.
And I would say even in the most, and I would say even in the most light of emotional books, like for instance, I remember one period in my life when I was mourning my grandmother's death at the same time as I was going through a relationship breakup. I was out of emotion, and PG Woodhouse books got me through. And I have to say, there was no great emotional investment, and that was what I needed at the time. I needed to just, this is entertaining, and no one's going to get hurt. I don't really care, But the characters all behaved as those characters would behave. Bertie and Worcester will always be Bertie and Worcester. They won't do something else just because, and that's what keeps us going, our faith in the characters.
Yeah. I was just going to say that, Mariana, I like that you brought up a history book, because there's a very common conception I've heard that history is mankind's attempt to assign a narrative to events. Mm-hmm. Like we are ingrained to find this sort of familiar narrative structure in pretty much everything that happens, real or fictional. And I think that is really something that is universal and part of why we are the storytelling animal. Moving on, part of the enduring appeal of fantasy as a whole, not just cozy fantasy, but fantasy, the whole genre, is that it contains a strong element of wish fulfillment, often in the context of breaking out of the tedium of everyday life and going on some exciting adventure. The Conradian call to adventure, hero's journey, all of that. Cozy fantasy inverts this somewhat, with world-weary characters returning home or even creating a new home for themselves. But even so, it retains that central element of wish fulfillment that is core to the wider genre, because the things that the protagonists of a cozy fantasy seek are things that we all long for as human beings, namely community, belonging, and purpose. Is longing for these fundamental human desires something that you've incorporated into your work, whether consciously or unconsciously? Sarah, you want to take that?
Yes. My answer is yes. Consciously. Definitely consciously. One of the things that I've discovered, that if you write a lot of books, you start discovering the things that you're obsessed with that you might not have previously known you were obsessed with, such as things talking that shouldn't be talking. That apparently is one of my obsessions. But my other obsession that I've been writing about a lot is different ways to be strong, and what does it mean to be a strong person. And I think my answer when I'm writing cozy fantasy is that kindness is strength, that connection with other people is strength, that love and companionship is strength. So basically my book is just like in favor of the Care Bear stare as a solution to all problems.
Yes, I think with cozy fantasy, I'm not going to name names because that would be really unfair. The cozy fantasy novels, the rare cozy fantasy novels that I've bounced off of, were ones where I didn't see any recognition that bad things do happen. And the cozy fantasy that I love and that sends me out feeling empowered and feeling stronger and able to take on my own life and, in our world full of issues, is the cozy fantasy that acknowledges that but gives us the hope that we can try for something better. We can write, and that's, as a writer, I think about writing towards the world that I want, which doesn't mean writing a utopia every time, but it means showing characters, making those hard choices, fighting the hard battles. And when we were talking about J.R. Tolkien earlier, and who is incredibly cozy in so many aspects, I have been just watching the films again for the first time with my whole family now that my youngest is old enough. And I was thinking about just how the greatest sin in this whole trilogy is despair. There are so many moments, when people when are faced with, this is impossible, you should give up now. It makes so much sense. But the people who despair are like the most dangerous people there, like Denethor. And so I'm always aiming for that feeling of not uneducated hope, not a careless hope, but a hope that's grounded in an understanding that this is hard, but it matters.
I think a lot of what works as the escapist fantasy for cozy fantasy is that it isn't actually fully escapist, is that the goals are ultimately things that we might actually do or get. We're basically using fantasy to talk about stuff you might actually accomplish or aspire to in your life. You're not going to slay a dragon, but you might find your people. You might, open your small business. You might find personal peace. And you talk about the Lord of the Rings. And ultimately, the whole point of the book is to get back home and tend to your garden and marry the girl down the street. That's the ultimate fantasy of Lord of the Rings, is that Sam gets back home.
Yes.
So it's like an attainable fantasy. All this stuff happens in between, but the real goal is one you could actually have.
Right. The point there is the back again. I love that. Yeah, no.
Yeah, there and back again.
Yes. So, I I'm totally vibing with everybody's responses on this, and just like want to reiterate that moment of humans getting a strength, a power from knowing that they have some power over themselves in their own lives, right? Like at small and at big. But I think that we're probably here concentrating on the small. That's what we're getting at. But that's just repeating stuff other people have said in other words, which I guess as writers we do a lot. So I'll not apologize.
Fair
for
game.
It.
Very true. Awesome. I want to offer up a brief clarification. I think I said Conradian earlier because somehow I mixed up Joseph Conrad and Joseph Campbell. So I meant Campbellian. That was going to bother me if I didn't correct myself.
Thank you. Honestly, I'm glad because I was trying to make that make sense. And now it does. But also I was like, dude, I got to go. I have homework.
Heart of Darkness.
Heart of Darkness,
exactly.
Tower of Myth. They're basically the same thing, right?
We're good. It's basically the same. Yeah.
But there was another live earlier that mentioned Joseph Conrad, and that's clearly why he infected my brain. Moving along. Common theme in cozy fantasy is starting over or making a fresh start, which I think is something that you guys all largely incorporate into your work. Travis and Sarah's books both involve a protagonist moving to a new place and starting their life over again. Marti, Wild Seed involves a young girl going to a magic academy. Mariana, your protagonist, literally goes back in time. And I think that this partially harkens back to that sort of wish fulfillment aspect we were just talking about, where we all have points in our life where we wish we could go back and take the other path, sort of like you were saying earlier, Travis, or to just re-examine what it might have been like if we had chosen the road less traveled. Why do you think cozy fantasy lends itself so well to these themes of second chances and new beginnings? Mariana, if you want to start.
I mean, it's the ultimate wish fulfillment to be able to like do something over again in a way that you want. And because cozy fantasy is all about empathy and the catharsis of like feeling good at the end, being able to, like, there's nothing that feels quite as good as being able to right a wrong, like being able to do something over again. Shoestring theory is based off like one of my like favorite guilty pleasure genres, which is like, I feel like goes hand in hand with cozy fantasy, which is like isekai manhwa and isekai manga, which is like the protagonist gets to go back in time or like live out a different lifetime because their life sucks so bad in the present. And being able to just like escape in a way that is so almost ludicrous is something that I always really liked. And it's something that's really, really fun to play around. And yeah, I think it's just like cozy fantasy lends itself so well to the ultimate act of wish fulfillment, which is just not just doing something good, but doing something that was bad and making it like very good for yourself. That was like a very simplistic, like a kind of a fumbling way to say that just like second chances are one of my favorite things to write about.
So it almost ties into the desire to absolve ourselves of our past wrongdoings.
Yeah.
Stephanie, you're muted.
Stephanie, you're muted.
Sorry.
We've all been there. It's fine.
Yes. Well, I think it also sort of speaks to that just really powerful message that it can get better. And I mean, we see that in so many aspects of society. There's the whole LGBTQ movement saying it gets better to, teens who are struggling. It's one of the biggest hopes that we have as humans is that even if we're stuck in a bad place, that doesn't mean it's the end. We can make it better. And that's just one of the most hopeful messages out there.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, 100% that. It totally ties into the hope thread that runs through cozy fantasy. The hope that it's not too late. No, you don't have to be the 16-year-old chosen one with the magical sword that's been delivered from whatever. You can be the 40-something starting over, or the one that's had the heartbreak and thinks that they'll never find love again, and still find happiness, still find your family, your place, your people, still find your dreams lying ahead of you that you can go grab, even if they're different than what you thought they might be before, that it's never too late.
I agree. And I would just add on, because my protagonists are young, right? And young people have regret. They do things that they wish they could have undone that never happened in the first place. I hopefully, I mean, you never know what you're actually doing, but what I'm hoping to do is give young people like both the setting and the opportunity to say, well, we all do things that are wrong legitimately, right? Everybody does things that are sometimes truly wrong. And even if you didn't do it on purpose, there is a way to learn from it. There is a way to actually apologize for it. And there is a way to rebuild a love and a trust where you maybe would have thought it was broken and just tried to throw it away or ghost the person, or like that there's still hope in there. So I think and just for the record, because you're talking about this book, right? But just for the record, the fresh start is like actually horrifying for her. She has the roughest time of anything ever. Like that is like the least cozy part of the school is a little bit rough for her. So just heads up if you go in being like, and then she gets to the school, no, and then she gets to the school. It's like it's a little sad.
Yeah, and I think Marty, that's especially for a younger audience, that's such an important message to have, because I feel like we are very much in an age where whenever mistake you make can be posted online for millions of people. It is very hard to allow grace for ourselves or others, and that especially for the younger generation who have grown up as digital natives, they need to know that it is okay for them to have the space to make those mistakes and grow, rather than feeling like they're forced to double down on the wrong things they've done.
Double down or pretend that they never existed, right? Like there is a way to acknowledge your own humanity, and which includes acknowledging your mistakes and also how you're growing forward. And I think that I honestly, legitimately, and I tell kids this all the time, I do a ton of school visits, and that's the magic. Like that's the magic, and it's dug in there. It's all around us. So.
Yeah. All right, I have 2 more questions prepared, and then we will open up the floor for the audience. First of those 2 questions, the boom of cozy fantasy as a subgenre coincides with a similar rise in popularity of another fantasy subgenre, namely romantasy or romantic fantasy. Both genres focus very heavily on character relationships, which are often, though not always, the primary drivers of the plot. And many cozy fantasies do incorporate romantic subplots. And while I think there's overlap between the 2 genres, I would like to know, what do you think the major dividing line between romantasy and cozy fantasy is, and how vital is romance to a cozy fantasy? Stephanie, I think you are the person to answer this one.
I am all about romantasy and cozy fantasy. So yes, just to be really clear to start with, I think it is absolutely not vital to have a romance for it to be a cozy fantasy. I think there's a huge market of people who are not interested in romance in their books and still love cozy fantasy, and platonic connection is incredibly powerful. You know, that can be incredibly that can be the wonderful happy ending. But as someone who does love romance and does love fantasy, and this is making my day, on a large level, the concurrent rise, and I think they're really a natural fit, and I don't think there is a very clear dividing line. I've seen that in reviews of arcs of my next book. There are people who say, oh well, this is don't worry, it's mostly cozy fantasy, even though there is some romance. And I've seen people say, oh, it's mostly just a romance, but there is some fantasy. So I think it's the line is really just starting with, where does the reader think is the most important subplot? And if the reader is perceiving the most important plot to be the romance, it's probably going to be more romantasy. And if the reader considers the sort of more magical world element and non-romantic elements the most important part, then it's not romantasy in their head.
Nice. Anyone else have any thoughts about the crossover between romantasy and cozy?
I just have a question, since I haven't written romantasy specifically. Is it commonly accepted that romantasy has the same requirements as capital R romance?
Yes, 100%.
Okay.
And Travis, I have actually been in professional forums where people are debating hotly whether or not Legends and Lattes is a romantasy, but everyone loves
think it's a
it
romantasy.
side away.
I don't think it is. And it wasn't going to even have romance in it until about halfway through, and it really ended up.
I'm happy it did.
It was the right thing to do, and it made sense. But it was originally supposed to be about that platonic connection, about what's an adult friendship that I actually want, as somebody who's in my 40s, as compared to what I thought a friendship was when I was younger. And so I'm just way more interested in adult conversations now.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, I think like defining genres is always such a sticky thing, because they're so mushy and blurry, and it's so personal and subjective. But and I definitely think with romantasy and cozy fantasy, there's definitely an area where it overlaps. I personally tend to think as cozy fantasy, when it does have romance, which it doesn't always, has a non-toxic relationship at its core. And that's part of one of the defining things. So if you do have a romantasy that's cozy fantasy, I expect everybody to be behaving in healthy manners towards each other.
Can we backtrack real quick, just for clarity for the audience and frankly myself? Stephanie, what are those expectations for capital R romance that Travis was referring to?
The expectation, the absolute prime directive of romance as a genre is that there will be a happy ending. And it's coming back. It's one of the reasons it fits so well with cozy fantasy. It's all about giving the reader that safe space. Things can get scary. Things can get intense halfway through the book. You think, how on earth are they ever going to get together? I can't imagine it. But by the end, they do. And if the writer is good, then you believe it. And so if you're writing romantasy, which is really just romance in a fantasy setting, or a fantasy with a strong romance, then the couple does, or the throuple, or whatever combination you're writing, does have to end up happily romantically partnered. And there can be some blurriness on whether it's a happily ever after, or whether it's a happily for now. Who knows in 5 years. But they have to be happy at the end of the book, and their romantic dilemma, like the essential romantic dilemma of, should we and can we become a romantic, unit? It has to be answered with a yes by the end of the book.
And I don't think, and I don't think that this sort of like rule should be, to go back to the topic of the panel, it should be treated as a limit. I don't think of it as a limit. I think of it as a promise you're fulfilling to the reader. You're giving them a promise to go on a particular kind of journey and have a particular kind of experience. And you want to fulfill that promise so that they have a good time.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And as a reader, it's why so often in my most stressed out times, I'll go through a binge of only reading romance, because I need that reassurance. I'm going to have I may have an exciting time or scary time or a comforting time along the way, but at the end, I know it's going to be okay. And that is a wonderful thing as a reader, and when you're in particular situations, especially.
Yeah. Like you said, Sarah, going back to the top, I think we've really established that genre is just about setting up reader expectations and then fulfilling them. Still talking genre, as the subgenre of cozy fantasy grows, I think we're beginning to see more crossover with other genres and subgenres under the wider speculative fiction umbrella. Becky Chambers' books, for example, are often cited as cozy sci-fi, whereas Nevo's Singing Hill Cycles really kind of toes the line between cozy fantasy and epic fantasy. What genre crossover with cozy fantasy do you anticipate or would like to see as more writers join the subgenre? And Marti, you go ahead and take this one.
Right. right?
I think you
So,
just
like,
froze for a second.
Oh,
I thought it was
am
me.
I here? Have I returned?
yes.
Yeah.
Yay.
Okay, excellent.
Go ahead.
I was
Yay.
gonna, obviously, cozy mystery has been a thing for a very long time. Such a fun thing. Cozy detective stories, etc. Right? I would really love for people. I would love for somebody, just like even almost as an intellectual exercise, right, to figure out how to be able to make cozy horror. Hear me out.
Yes,
Okay.
John Wiswell. John Wiswell is writing it.
Oh,
and
have I
Tanya
missed
Huff.
it? Okay, wait, hold on.
Yes.
Tell Stephanie.
Yes.
Someone You Can Build a Nest In by John Wiswell is the one she's referring to.
Yes,
Yeah,
and my I have to admit, even though that I love John's writing and it is absolutely cozy horror, that one is still a little gruesome for my stomach. I'm a real wimp with horror, and I'm really sorry, John. I think you're watching this tonight because John's a friend. I love John's writing, and you should read it. You should read Someone to Build a Nest In.
Yes.
But also, Tanya Huff has one coming out this spring. Oh, I can't believe I've forgotten the name. I will post it in the YouTube comments.
There we
And it is
go.
cozy. It's cozy horror. It's set in Canada. It's in this very nice little small town where everyone just happens to worship the dark entity that signed a deal with the
I-
miners back in the 1800s. And two heroines fall in love along the way of preventing an apocalypse. It's
I
hilarious.
absolutely love this. I absolutely love this. Okay, so I'm gonna do a little bit of digging into this. The reason that I said it is because I am not good at being a gamer. I love games, but I'm not good at it because I'm afraid, right? Like I'm afraid for my player to die. I don't want any of that to happen. So then all of the games that I can play are ones where I know for sure that my player is not going to die, right? Like that's not an option that is on the table. So then I can play. There are some darker games that have that like as a promise to me as a player, and I was like, I can't venture into horror. I don't have the constitution for it, but I could if it were cozy. So thank you, Stephanie. I needed that starter list. I appreciate that so much.
But also, I'm sorry I got overexcited and interrupted you.
That's the whole point. Like, thank you. Like, otherwise,
I
we could
love
have had
that
a bunch
with
of
you.
separate interviews. Like, and yes, that was absolutely perfect for that. And then,
And it's direct descendant. Direct descendant. I just looked it up. I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Direct
That's the
descendant.
Tiny
All
Huff
right.
one.
Okay, excellent, perfect.
I
Another,
love I'm the same way with
um,
video games though. My son and I played Breath of the Wild together, and I would collect the mushrooms and he'd fight all the bad guys. It worked out great.
No, exactly. Somebody promised me that Breath of the Wild was cozy, and so I have Breath of the Wild, and it's not cozy for me because I am not a gamer, right? So every time a Link falls from some dramatic height, like I can't, and so then okay, so there's that. But I'll tell you, Sarah, if you're the way with me, then also Witchwood. Adorable little game.
Okay.
And if you're a touch
Excellent.
darker, The Cult of the Lamb. Excellent. Okay, so
My
great.
wife loves
But-
that one.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
Obsessed. So love it a ton. So there's that. The other way that I would love is just like for selfish reasons is I love fantasy settings bleeding into our world, which is why I do it a lot, all the time. In fact, I would love to see, I guess, more of a crossover between, I guess, urban fantasy is what we're calling it, and the cozy as well. Like, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Before it goes away from my brain completely, another recommendation for a cozy horror is The September House by Carissa Orlando. Basically, it's first person, very unreliable narrator, but it's a woman who moves into a haunted house and decides, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to live with the walls bleeding and the screams at night and all that.
Yes.
It treads the line between the two very beautifully.
that sounds
Other
great.
crossover genres anyone would like to see? No?
I want to see more YA cozy fantasy because most of the cozy fantasy right now is aimed towards adults, and I think that teens are so stressed out with right now because the world's on fire and they need it too.
I have to say, part of why I'm focusing on the adult romantasy right now is I had, I'm trying to think of how to say this, but several years ago, I had a meeting with my last kids publisher, and after I had done one trilogy with them, and they were lovely, they were supportive, they were helping my career, and so they said, take out the cozy for the next series, make it less cozy. We want really big stakes. We want the world to be in danger. We don't want the cozy chocolate house, this time round. And I need to make it clear, I'm not complaining, because I was so lucky to get that kind of editorial input from people who really cared about my career and wanted to keep me on, But as it turned out, I wrote my next duology. I am not going to say don't buy my books, because I love those books. I put everything into them. But I was so happy that cozy was not something people were shying away from in adult romantasy, that I could, if I went and focused on that for a while, that I could do all the cozy I wanted and not worry about it.
Awesome. All right. So we are at 10 after. We have about 15 minutes to take audience questions. But before we do, does anyone have any final thoughts or anything that we haven't discussed yet, but you would like to real quick?
If there are any writers out there that want to write cozy fantasy, go for it. It's so much fun. You'll love it.
Seconded. All right. Let me take a look at the YouTube commentary. All right. First question. If there are no limits, then is it more of a vibe than a genre? What's the difference between regular fantasy with cozy elements like The Hobbit or Harry Potter and something like Legends and Lattes?
I just want to say, maybe this isn't the case for all authors. I don't start writing a book being like, this is going to be a cozy fantasy. That's just kind of a thing that happens to the book once it's out there. So I don't really have an answer for that. I don't know what divides cozy fantasy in that way. Because to me, I could make a case for a lot of like fantasy, like high fantasy books being cozy, just because based on the way that they make me feel, just that we didn't have the words to describe cozy fantasy at the time. So it really, to me, it's a little bit of a marketing thing. But I mean, that's my opinion.
Well, it's that idea of changing
cozy
titles.
fantasy.
Yeah.
I think Bilbo's unconscious for most of the big battle.
Right?
He was.
Yeah, I mean, I think. Oh, sorry.
I was just saying very much what Travis was saying. I do think The Hobbit is cozy fantasy. There's so much focus on the little details, like we were talking about with Lord of the Rings. In general, Tolkien really got into those cozy grounding elements. And I would say, although I tend I haven't reread the Harry Potter books for several years because of the author, and I have a trans daughter. It's a thing for me, but I would say, of course, part of what made those so successful was all of their emphasis on those cozy elements, the incredible feasts that the kids eat, the real detail of these amazing kinds of food. That those are all very cozy things. It was just that it wasn't being marketed that way.
Right. I would actually, I think this is the first time ever that I've disagreed with you, Stephanie. So
You're allowed.
it had to happen at some point, right?
10
So
years.
I think that, I don't think that there was an emphasis on those elements. I just think that those were the most interesting elements of the books. And so then those are the elements that got carried away. And the reasons that I recommended them to children, I think that I no longer do, was because of those elements. Yeah.
We don't disagree.
Okay. Well, there we go. Backtrack, undone. We still have to do it.
I want to circle back real quick to the comment on The Hobbit, because I think that there's something to explore there in how important tone is to defining whether it's cozy or not. Because The Hobbit is told in such a incredibly different narrative voice than The Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion, which is also vastly different from The Lord of the Rings. Despite all three of these stories taking place in the same universe, and two of them even following a similar set of characters, they are hugely tonally different. And that's where the difference between epic and cozy comes in, is Tolkien's got that very like avuncular sitting by the fire telling you the story with Bilbo and his adventures, whereas Lord of the Rings is all epic all the time, even as it does have those softer moments and the gentle love and empathy between the main characters. It's part of why the Hobbit movies fall apart, is because they try to emulate the tone of the Lord of the Rings while also...
It's the wrong tone.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. Right.
That's just,
and that has so much to do with character perspective, which I think Tolkien, so and that's because all the same, like we're talking about the same time periods for most of those stories, and it was just who was aware of what was happening and who wasn't, right?
Yeah.
Like who was aware mainly of what was going on in their village, right? And who could see things at a larger scale. So then, yeah, I think so. That to answer the commenter's question, yes, I think it's mostly vibes. If you get the cozy vibe out of it, then it is probably cozy for you, right? If it's making you feel that, what did you say, Sarah? Tea and a cat with wings on your lap and a blanket. Like if you get that vibe from it, then it is definitely
cozy.
It's cozy. It's cozy for you. And just using that video game reference, for some people, Zelda Breath of the Wild is cozy. And for me, not cozy. Because I'm like, while I'm playing it, as opposed to like, That's,
I think the tricky,
different tone.
I think the tricky thing about vibes is that it sounds like it's like this ineffable thing that just floats down and settles on your story. Oh, it just ended up with these vibes. But vibes are just very deliberate. It's a result of your perspective and your choices as a writer. It's just as deliberate as any plot development. So it's not, it sounds floaty, but it's not. It's actually very concrete, and people are making deliberate decisions in order to evoke a specific vibe.
Yeah. Writing is all about conservation of detail. Shouldn't be anything in there that we didn't intend for there to be. That commenter has 2 more questions, but I'm going to skip ahead because I want to make sure that the other people who asked also get a chance, and then I'll come back to them if we have time. Question: I feel that a lot of cozy fantasy involves a place that changes the characters, a healing place. Do you think this is a formula, or is just a similarity with cozy games and the idea of cozy?
Place that changes the characters, a healing place. So, wide genre. I'll jump in while other people are thinking. Wide genre. I think that healing is a part of that hope feeling, because we know that we're going to have hurts, and so then the opportunity for healing is important. So I think that that probably is, at least metaphorically, always true, even if it's not literally always true. In every story I'm thinking about, I can do it for real in most of them of mine, except for this one where it's not but it's definitely a healing place is in her coven. It's her group of people that she finds, and that they become like literally interconnected, their magic, and that is very healing, and they will always be that healing place for each other. And so then that therefore qualifies, but it's not literal, right? So I don't know, what do other people think about that?
I think it's just a tool, and it's one to evoke a specific effect, right? I want to make a book about cozy community and people like finding the people in their lives that are important. I could do that on a windswept snowy mountaintop, or I could do it in a used bookstore. Which one is going to be more conducive of providing those feelings that support what I'm attempting to do? I think it's just the tool to hand that makes sense to achieve your aims. That doesn't mean you couldn't do it on a windswept snowy mountaintop, but it would probably take more work and require you to bring other things into the mix to make it function.
Yeah, I think
tool really does.
Really
I was going to say it really does.
Oh, sorry. You guys go.
I'm so sorry. The lag is probably terrible. Yeah, I was going to say it really does lend itself to like the actual characters and how they interact with the space, because like Hell of a Boss comes to mind as something that's like, it's not cozy, but it has a lot of emotional moments, like as a TV show. And it's set in literally hell. It's in hell, but you still like feel quite emotional about these characters and about their personal development. And like you empathize with them because of the way that their feelings are expressed.
Sarah, what
Yeah,
did
a
you have
place is healing. Sorry.
I was just going to call back to Travis's word of tool, and I think that that's a really good way. Trope has such negative connotations as if it's something limiting, whereas you should just consider them all your tools in your writer's toolbox, and like pick the ones that serve your story the best. I mean, we're all trying to cast the spell, so you want to grab for the spell ingredients that are going to make it the most powerful.
Stephanie, go ahead.
I was just going to sort of piggyback on what Mariana was talking about and say that a healing setting, usually it's more about who's there that makes it healing. You know, the castle in my book is healing for Felix when he comes to, but 20 years ago when Saskia's parents were murdered there, etc., it was not a healing place. Going back to what Travis said about picking specific settings, it reminded me of Rebecca K. Thorne's books, Can't Spell Treason Without Tea, which is in fact set in this very windswept, snowy area, and where they have to try to make a home out of this old, I can't remember, it's like a barn that was used by bandits. Yeah, but it becomes, but it's incredibly cozy because of the community they form around them and the way they build it and the beautiful plants they plant in, in the bookshop and so forth.
Absolutely. All right, we are at 10 minutes left, so I'm going to speed on through. We have some questions about Travis's next book, which I think we'll get to when we get to the closing and tell everybody about our current in progresses. Can a cozy fantasy be for kids? Yes, generally, I think.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yes, absolutely.
For sure.
I can think of one book that was marketed as kind of cozy that I read and had a very sudden and very jarringly placed sex scene. And that, but
wow.
Yeah, I'm not going to name it because I don't want to shame anybody or anything. It goes back to that whole making promises with the tone and the genre.
Yeah. I mean, what like 70% of Studio Ghibli movies?
Yes.
Yeah.
Caroline Carlson's book, Wicked Marigold, is a wonderful, cozy fantasy for kids about a girl who's so upset when her perfect princess, older sister, comes back, escapes from the wicked wizard. And everyone's so excited to see her that the younger girl decides, well, I'm just going to be wicked and I'll go live with the wicked wizard. And she sort of plants herself in his castle, and it's hilarious. Marty's books, just read every single one of Marty's books, really. But the first one that I read was Jupiter Storm, and it's just delightful and so cozy and comforting. And baby dragon. Oh.
She does accidentally usher in a new age of dragons, just heads up. To the thing, so then that's
I think
one does.
I think this push for cozy fantasy also comes from adults wanting to relive this childlike wonder. So it's a no-brainer that there should be more cozy fantasy for kids.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely.
And just to be the annoying teacher person in the room, I don't think that kids should have kids are just humans. So I try not to limit kids on what they can read. Now you probably want to keep talking to them. not necessarily read alone, but definitely read. Yeah, give it a shot.
Absolutely. And can I just say, Sarah, I forgot to include Sarah's books in the list of wonderful, cozy middle grade fantasies. Catalyst is my personal favorite. And it's about these kids who find this tiny kitten who starts growing and growing, and it becomes a really big problem. But it's adorable and very funny.
Oh, that actually ties in really nicely to what will probably be the last question we have time for. Question for the panel. Do you have a cozy fantasy you'd recommend, preferably written by someone not on this panel?
I have one, The Very Irregular Society of Secret Witches by Sangu Mandana. I adore it. I own it in paper book, audiobook, ebook. If I ever see a hardcover edition, I'll grab that too.
Great recommendation.
T. Kingfisher, quite a few books, honestly. Nettle and
All
Bone,
of them.
Thorn Hedge, or both.
Hard second.
I mean, she does write horror stuff, but so if you want somebody writing cozy horror, Ursula Vernon's probably going to be the person. Paladin's Grace stuff is also kind of squarely falls in there.
Who else?
I would second all of those, and I would add The Teller of Small Fortunes by Julie Leong. That's wonderful.
I've forgotten every single book I've ever read. I think you just can't really go wrong with the original cozy fantasy, which is Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. I think that might be the inception.
I think Terry Pratchett counts a lot of the time.
Yes, as well, yeah.
Tiffany Aching, definitely. I have one to recommend that is not released yet, but that I have baited for and is coming out this, I believe, December. And that is Violet Thistlethwaite is Not a Villain Anymore by Emily Krempholtz, which is about a
I love
plant
that
witch.
title.
It's so good. It's about a plant witch who is the head enforcer to the Dark Lord of the setting. Dark Lord gets killed, and she decides to go and start a new life and do better than she did before. It's very redemptive and about the healing power of community, and it is great. That comes out in, like I said, I believe this December. Definitely check it out when it comes out.
That
All
sounds
right.
great.
Marty, did you have any cozies to recommend besides our co-panelists?
So I'm actually reading right now. I'm reading romance. So which is crazy. Well, for me, it's crazy. But right now I'm reading romance, and also I'm gonna throw one in that has really good cozy vibes in it. Just like but if you think of it in the way that that Harry Potter has cozy vibes and like excellent points. If you haven't read yet the Marvelers books by Danielle Clayton, there is some world saving in it, but all of the intercuts in it are lovely and cozy and just really full in their fantasy points. So I think that'll be my add-in.
Awesome. All right. Well, we are drawing near to the end of our time. So let's go through alphabetically by last name. Where can people find you? And what are you working on now? And is there anything you'd like to announce? Travis, you go ahead and start.
I'm pretty much Travis Baldree everywhere. TravisBaldree.com, whatever, Blue Sky, Facebook, what have you. I probably interact most on Blue Sky. I've already run out of answering the questions. Like, what am I coming out next? Is that what it was?
Yeah,
I've got a very short buffer in my brain today. Third book in Legends and Lattes series comes out November 11th. It's called Brigands and Bread Knives. It is set after Legends and Lattes and is a sort of sequel, but also a standalone that may or may not be cozy fantasy.
Awesome. Stephanie?
I literally got the author copies and opened them directly before this panel, so I'm going to flash it again because I'm too excited. So I've got Wooing the Witch Queen coming out next month. And tomorrow I'm going to be diving into my first revisions of book 2, which is called Enchanting the Fae Queen. And I also have a short story coming out, which is definitely cozy fantasy, called Mail Order Magic in the Sunday Morning Transport magazine in March.
Awesome.
Oh, and you can find me everywhere, stephanieburgess.com, etc.
Perfect. Mariana?
Yeah, I'm Marinskos everywhere. All of the social medias, I have them. I don't use all of them, but I do have them because I had to claim the username. Most of my projects are coming out next year, actually. So I've got a few graphic novels in the works. Forgive Me Not is the big one. The Demon of Beausoleil comes out a little bit later in the year in 26. This year, just kind of stay tuned and I'll probably drop some stuff sporadically. Like I'll be working on something and I'll be like, and suddenly all of us, like with no marketing, I'll be like, hey, look, I did it. I did it.
Full of Beyonce. All right. Marty?
So the last book in my Seeds of Magic series, which is a trilogy, the one where a little girl accidentally ushers in a new age of dragons just from her naturalist curiosity, is coming out this year. That is the Book of Dragons. And I have the second book in this series, The Secret Society of Rebel Girls, where some kids find a mailbox in the woods that is actually a secret time taco that allows them to send letters to women in history and get actual answers back. So that the second, we have not settled on a title for that book yet, but the second book in that series, The Secret Society of Rebel Girls, will be out this year as well.
All right. And Sarah?
I'm at Sarah Beth Durst everywhere: Instagram, TikTok, Blue Sky, Threads, Facebook, blah, blah, blah. And my next book is coming out July 15th. And it's set in the same world as It's the spell shop. It's standalone. It's about a librarian and a gardener and a truly excessive number of talking plants and a winged cat and tiny dragons and second chances. And I'm really excited about it.
Fantastic. All right. And I have been Marshall J. Moore. You can find me most places at Marshall J. Moore Author, Instagram, Blue Sky, TikTok, while it's currently Schrodinger's social media app. Yeah, my third pirate cozy fantasy, Enemy of the Empire, just came out, and I am currently working on a horror fantasy, or horror cozy, rather. So stay tuned for that. All right. This has been a fantastic panel. Thank you all for joining me. Thank you guys for your insightful answers to all these questions. Audience, thank you for being here, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. So long.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.